Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversations. Africa is a colossal continent of 54 countries and 1.2 billion people. Yet, it remains barely studied and poorly understood. By 2050, Africa, together with India, will be home to 42% of humankind, or 4.1 billion people. In the last 2 decades, China has emerged as the most significant player in Africa. According to one estimate, China's investments and infrastructure engagement in Africa totaled about 2 trillion US dollars. Its trade with Africa grew from 10.6 billion in 2005 to over 221 billion in 2014. India's relations with Africa have to acknowledge the sharpening competition with China, not only in the African continent but also in the Western Indian Ocean. And yet, India should not get bogged down in a rivalry with China in Africa. It is essential, therefore, to understand Africa, what it means to India, and gauge the state of India-Africa relations against the backdrop of the great game in Africa, where players from China to the EU to the UAE and Turkey, along with India, are vying for presence, influence, and strategic depth. To discuss India-Africa relations and the strategic challenge from China in the continent and in the Western Indian Ocean, I have with me Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. He is a distinguished fellow at the Gateway House. As the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs from 2012 to 2015, he played a key role in strengthening India's track to research and outreach activities. He served as Ambassador to Myanmar and Mexico and as High Commissioner to Kenya and South Africa. Ambassador Bhatia, several Africa watchers seem to make the argument that there is a great game underway in Africa. For instance, once dominated by European powers, the east coast of Africa and the southwestern Indian Ocean have witnessed dramatic expansion of Chinese influence in the last decade or so. So do you think there is a great game underway and this is increasingly dominated by China, and there's nothing that others can do about it? Where do you stand on that?
So, first of all, talking quite frankly, the great game is a coinage which is very popular with us,
right,
the scholars and the former diplomats. The previous word used has been the third scramble for Africa, but even that is outdated, because while the previous two scrambles were for territory and for national allegiance in the context of the Cold War, this time it is all very different, and it is really about seeking influence and friendship and partnership of African countries. On the second part of the question, it is not about China only. Certainly China is a very active player, and sometimes there is a tendency to see things China versus others. But I think my thesis is that much of the world is involved in Africa today, and so we should take a nuanced look.
How dominating is the Chinese influence there? There was a US Department of Defense report from last year, 2021, which says China may have considered military installations in 13 African countries. This probably tells me that you're looking at a China that is determined to dominate the geopolitical sphere in Africa in the years to come. Or am I exaggerating my point?
No, you obviously are very well placed to make that argument. I think China obviously is playing a much bigger role or game in the Indo-Pacific. In comparison, I think as I study, the Chinese factor is perhaps not so dominating in Africa, because as I said, other countries are also active. But nevertheless, China's presence in terms of the relationship in the military field and or the defense field, economic, political and diplomatic field, that has been very significant in the past 20 years or so.
Mr. Bhatia, you write that the current century presents a picture of a sharpening competition between China and India on the African continent. what has been. So why do you also write that India has tried to project subtly that its engagement with Africa has been different in motivation, methods and impact? So your focus seems to be India-China competition there, and you say that India's approach has been somewhat different. Can you explain that for viewers?
Yes, indeed. I think I would be very candid and say that while India's association and partnership with Africa has been of a much older vintage, the fact is that China, which had somewhat limited relationship until the 90s, really started sort of accelerating its car, so to say. And in the past 2 decades, in sheer terms of the money invested, the number of projects, the volume of trade, the value of investment, in all those terms, China obviously really went ahead, and that is the reason why China is always considered as an important element in Africa. I would also say, and this is my argument in my book, which if you allow me I would like to just
Please,
show you India-China,
India-Africa.
India-Africa relations, changing horizons, and in this there is a particular chapter devoted to Africa-China tango, and there basically I am arguing that regardless of whatever or in whatever fashion you look at the China factor in Africa, the fact is that because China took so much interest in Africa, in a way it compelled or impelled or motivated other powers in the world to take also bigger interest in Africa. So that is something that is very important.
Right. Between when you were in Kenya and in South Africa, how did you see this transformation of the Chinese influence in the African continent? I mean, you must have witnessed it yourself, some of which you recount in your book. But can you sort of tell us some instances or something that sort of testifies as to how China made a determined effort to enhance its influence in the African continent?
I think they really changed their work style as the economic power of China really began to increase, and I truly saw this happening in front of my own eyes in 1998 when I went to Kenya. We could study the behavior of the Chinese embassy and the Chinese ambassador. They were still of the old school, ill-fitted clothes and unsure of English. But within 2 or 3 years at the UNEP session in Kenya, we saw how the young Chinese diplomats flown in from New York presented a very different, energetic, well-informed, westernized face of Chinese diplomacy. And then a few years later, when I was serving as your High Commissioner in South Africa, I again saw that the Chinese ambassador there was miles apart, worlds apart from the previous man in Kenya. So in a way, in a matter of a decade, as China had become a powerful economic player in the world, the effect was very visible in Africa also. And then if I may just say, in terms of putting in the investments in various economic partnership forms, it really shot up across much of Africa. So that was a very significant factor.
Sitting in 2021 today, when you look back at the last 2 decades and also probably looking ahead at China's role or China's place in Africa, what do you think are some of China's core interests or objectives in the African region? What do they want from this particular region? I mean, it's a rising superpower, obviously.
Yes, I think China has both very solid economic and political interests, and when you look at the two of them together, obviously strategic interests come into play as well. They are strongly interested in the African resources, natural resources, minerals, oil, gas, special minerals and everything else, the natural wealth. Politically, they notice very clearly that it is a continent of 54 countries, and therefore in all international fora they do matter. But I think above all, China has this very strong feeling of being a leader of the global south. a position that we contest strongly from India, and I am sure we will talk about India as well. So, there is the politico-diplomatic angle as well, and then of course, as probably we would discuss as well, there is this whole thing that is happening in the Western Indian Ocean, in terms of the maritime issues. So, we can say that China does present a fascinating subject for any scholar to study when it comes to Africa and the Indian Ocean.
How do you compare that standing of China in the region? In fact, I was looking at a recent survey wherein it says that 76% of African youth surveyed across 15 countries named China as a foreign power with a positive influence on their lives, surpassing the United States. You're looking at an expansion of the Chinese soft power in Africa. How do you compare that with India's standing in the region? India has a long historic relationship with Africa, probably even going beyond that of China in many ways. But today, sitting in 2022, what are India's opportunities? What are India's challenges in the African continent?
I think what we are seeing unfolding in Africa between India and China, this is it's a marathon. It is not a short race. This is so because in Africa only the present generation, the last 30 years, they have begun to get acquainted with China. But with India, the relationship goes much longer and is therefore much deeper. And on top of that, I think I can say in all honesty that by and large, India is seen as a benign power, which is not the case with China. So, if we are comparing the two, as I argued, they are different, but if we are comparing the two, we have to basically remember that, barring on one or two aspects, India rarely comes under criticism, but China faces criticism all the time. Very clearly on China, I would argue that there are three schools of thought: those who feel that China is doing very well, those who feel China simply cannot do anything well, and third, which is a very sophisticated nuanced view, which points out that China has done some good things, but China is also involved in doing many bad things as well.
Right. You've been in South America, you've been in South Asia, in Myanmar, also in Africa. There seems to be an increasing pushback to China. From now you just mentioned about Africa, also in South Asia, for example, look at Sri Lanka, for example. Is that something that you think is going to grow over the years compared to, say, India's influence in these countries, or relationship in these countries and regions, as it were? As you said, India is seen as a benign sort of influence, whereas China is probably seen as a more aggressive one. So what I'm trying to understand is, going forward, is that aggression going to be a problem for the Chinese as compared to the Indian influence in these countries?
I understand the question and the thinking behind it. I would say from the Indian perspective, I am optimistic, and I would also say that China is on a bit of a slippery path today. When we interpret developments both in Sri Lanka and other neighbors such as Myanmar or even Nepal, I think the reality of Chinese power is beginning now to become much more transparent to the host country. Sri Lanka, you have quoted a wonderful example. We all are, have our eyes fixed on it. I think Hambantota is becoming now a metaphor of how a major power should not deal with a small power. India does not have to draw lessons from it, because India simply would not go in that direction ever. When Prime Minister Modi went to Uganda and he gave that famous speech before the parliament explaining the heart of India's Africa policy, he made a point to say that, and rightly, he made a point to say that African priorities will be India's priorities. We have never heard Chinese presidents say something like this.
Interesting. Ambassador, a lot of people say that India should not stretch itself too thin. For instance, they say, what role does India have in Central Asia? I saw an article the other day which argues that India has no real stakes in Afghanistan. Point being that India should not really go beyond its immediate neighborhood or probably the Indian Ocean region and try and do things in those countries, including perhaps Africa. How do you counter that sort of a statement, which I think makes no sense? In other words, why is Africa important to India's economic and national security interests?
So, the first part of the question, Professor Jacob, my answer is that in the last 3 decades or so, India's world view has expanded. And so, once you have expanded your world view, you simply cannot sit at home and say, I will only do South Asia and major powers. Your natural platform of theater is the Indo-Pacific, which runs from California and Wellington to Kalimanjaro on the eastern coast of Africa. So, you simply now treat that as your destiny, but you do not stop at the eastern coast of Africa, you go beyond and you go right to the West Africa, because history, geography, geopolitics, geoeconomics are driving you there. If anything, the ambassadors in Latin America, crib and complain that there is not enough interest by India in Latin America, although that too has been increasing. So, I would say that with a broadening world view, you simply cannot afford to take a restrictive diplomatic view. This is basically what I would say. And about the second part, I think we can say that on India-Africa relationship, I have been very realistic in my book to point out that while in the last roughly say decade and a half, India has secured many important gains, especially through the summit diplomacy. But in the last 3 to 4 years, our grip is becoming a little loose, and that is because of COVID and Galwan and Ukraine. So, my plea to those who care for India-Africa relations is that we must try to recapture the momentum that we saw from 2008 to 2019.
Right. Right. Ambassador Bhatia, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific. I think in a sense, this is a great grand strategic concept, the Indo-Pacific confluence of 2 oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But again, the Indo-Pacific is viewed differently by different states. For some countries, the Western Indian Ocean do not really matter in the larger construct of Indo-Pacific. Where does Africa and the Indo-Pacific and the Western Indian Ocean figure in the Indian construction or conception of Indo-Pacific?
Thank you for asking this very pertinent question. So, the central question is the phrase Indo in the Indo-Pacific, does it stand for India or does it stand for the Indian Ocean? Americans may have a different idea, but India is very clear. Indo stands for the Indian Ocean. And the moment we accept that, that means the contours of Indo-Pacific definitely go to the eastern and southern shores of Africa. And that is where really the true importance of the Western Indian Ocean comes in. As we have seen in the map, there is this vast land coastline of India on the one side, and on the other side there is the vast long coastline of Africa running from Cape of Good Hope all the way to Djibouti. And this whole area, the Western Indian Ocean, is an area of natural interest to India, and India has to do a lot there. It already is doing something, but it has to do more.
Ambassador Bhatia, would you agree with me that there is too much focus on the South China Sea, less focus on the Indian Ocean, and even less focus on the Western Indian Ocean? Am I putting it correctly?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think you are absolutely on the dot.
Is that a function of the growing thinking in the West and the United States of the need to contain China? Obviously, India also has its own problems with China because of the preoccupation in those countries, the United States and in the Western countries, of the need to contain China. A lot of focus is around China, thereby ignoring what happens in other parts of the world, for example, the east coast of Africa or the Western Indian Ocean. Would you think that probably is one of the reasons behind
So
this?
this is a kind of Western, approach, or the American approach. But I see the signs of this changing slowly, because in the Indian Ocean also there are several rivalries that are going on, though they are not so much talked about. First of all, there is the US China strategic contestation ever since 2008, when Chinese Navy started building its footprint in the Indian Ocean. Americans and the Western navies have been watching them. Then there is the French angle. The French regard themselves as the Indo-Pacific power for good reasons. They have their territories there, they have their people there. So the French are involved, and then on top of that there is the Indian Navy. The Indian Navy typically, when it goes out, it first, I think, looks towards the Indian Ocean, and as a result there have been extensive efforts through all kinds of initiatives to build up the relationship with the island states and with the coastal states of eastern and southern Africa. You know, Professor, that out of 54 African countries, 38 are either islands or coastal states. So Africa has a very strong maritime angle, and India has to respond to that.
How do you characterize the security architecture in the Western Indian Ocean? Do you think the US-led initiatives like the combined maritime forces, of which India is a member, that's a way forward? I'm asking this because you don't really see much of an African participation in some of these Western-led initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, in the Western Indian Ocean. Is that the correct way of going about, or India should actually reach out to the African states and sort of get them on board as well?
I'm a votary of the second approach. I think if we are talking about India-Africa equation, then I think it's important for Indian diplomats and Indian scholars to try to comprehend what Africa is trying to do. Africa does have its own independent maritime strategy and approach. African integrated maritime strategy was developed by the African Union. They have spelled out very clearly what their needs are. If we look at that document, we find that first of all, they are very worried about the crime situation. All kinds of trans-border crimes on the sea, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, the rest of it. Then they are very worried about the illegal fishing in the vast economic zone around Africa. They don't have the capability, so people come after all. That is how the piracy began. Somalia was destroyed because the Europeans and others were coming and overfishing in their waters, as we know. And then on top of that, there are these natural disasters and the rest of it. So Africa is not just concerned about US or China or India. They are fundamentally focused on their own problems. And you are right, I think India can do more in terms of connecting with Africa, both on the maritime security side, and perhaps if you want to be development oriented, then on the blue economy side as well.
What is the state of the India-Africa defense and security relationship in a general sense of the term, just to sort of for our viewers?
I think the Modi government has been very conscious and active on it. I think in the last 3-4 years, with this stress on Atmanirbhar Bharat in terms of the defense sector, the idea is that we should expand our production, and Africa would be a natural market, provided there is greater stress on the training, cooperation and the rest of it. But again, we have to remember that Africa does not have all that much money or resources available. So we have to find constructive ways of advancing this defense partnership with Africa.
Right, you mentioned that India should play a more keen role in the Western Indian Ocean. Who are some of India's natural partners in the Western Indian Ocean region. Given the fact that countries like UK have signaled a desire for greater engagement, also perhaps France is a natural power in that part of the world. Should India seek more collaboration with these countries? I mean, the way I am seeing it, the Americans probably don't have that kind of interest there. The two natural countries that come to my mind are France and UK in terms of collaborating with India in the Western Indian Ocean. Or how I?
No, I agree with you. I think those two are very much in the front row. I know that if one tries to bring Germany into that category, somebody would say that Germans don't have much of a naval power, but their profile is changing. As we saw, Germans came here, made a big noise about their taking interest in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore they are a power without any colonial baggage. Therefore, they have some interest there, but not just being focused on the West. I think we are as an Asian country very deeply interested in Africa. We need to focus who are our key partners in Africa, and there of course, I mean the list is quite substantive. We have Mauritius and Seychelles and Maldives, and then of course going beyond that Madagascar, and then the entire east to south coast, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa. So if we look at Professor at the Indian Ocean Rim Association membership, which now has 23 members, 11 of them are African members, and if those are combined with India, that means India and Africa accounts for 52% of the membership of the IORA. So I think there is a need for us to develop the African pillar a bit more imaginatively by making more resources available to them.
And in doing so, making more resources available, I think we'll probably have to have more partners, like Japan, for instance, is a natural partner in terms of infrastructure or development aid, along with India in the African region.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, there was also this talk about the IPEF on the sidelines of the Quad Summit in Tokyo. I think that's also providing a certain economic muscle to the whole Indo-Pacific construct. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my own feeling is that Quad is one thing; it has a certain functionality, it has certain activities happening. But when you look at the Indo-Pacific, Indo-Pacific is a phrase. It's a it sounds nice, but what is the Indo-Pacific? So you need to infuse muscle from time to time. So is the economic partnership that India has with some of these countries, be it Japan or say for example even Germany for that matter, is that the future in sort of expanding the concept of the Indo-Pacific?
First of all, I remember your tweet which showed your curiosity about the Indo-Pacific economic framework. I am as curious about its future as you are. Is it merely an announcement, or is it going to be something more substantive? We sitting outside the government do not know, but we would hope that governments are serious and they would develop something more. On the question of the Indo-Pacific, I also want to share one new input with you. A number of African scholars have been calling us and have been in touch, and they are saying that if the Indian definition includes East Africa and Southern Africa in the Indo-Pacific, then they would like to really have much greater communication with the Indian scholarship community. So this is something, it is a message for our own, track 2 people, that you cannot on the one hand keep trying to convince Japanese and Americans and Australians that Indo-Pacific must include Africa, and yet not do any talking, any conversation with Africans. Absolutely. So there is a gap there, and it has to be bridged first at the track 2 level. Governments will follow suit. So I would particularly request people like you who have been at the forefront of writing and thinking, that we need to pull in not all of them, but some key countries like Kenya, South Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique, Madagascar, to come and understand what is going on in the Indo-Pacific region if we think that they are part of it.
Right. Ambassador, there has been a lot of curiosity in India about the Djibouti, the whole issue around Djibouti. What do you think are some of the possible future implications of China gaining this base in Djibouti?
It's a peculiar place, isn't it? It's a military base for all kinds of major powers,
Yep.
and you really wonder how it works. It's such a tiny place which hosts American military base, the Chinese military base, several European bases. I'm not really an expert. I've never been to Djibouti, but it seems to me that it is all a commercial, strong commercial angle by the host government. Whoever wants to set up a base, they are game for it. But I think the serious concern that the Chinese military base used to create until about 3 or 4 years back, I think that concern I sense is a bit less today, because clearly the Europeans are becoming very active. So, I would not worry too much about Djibouti right now. Djibouti is somewhat of a side issue. The real issue is more in the heart of the Western Indian Ocean, around the major island states.
Right. Ambassador, one final question, and that is about you being part of the establishment for a very long time, 37 years, and then you with ICW thereafter. Do you think there is enough space that Africa and the Western Indian Ocean occupy in the Indian strategic imagination, or is it decreasing, shrinking, increasing? What do you think is the case?
I have thought about this quite often, and I'll give you a very honest answer, because I ended my book on that answer. I think in the past generation, that means in the past 20-25 years, the interest in India about Africa and the Western Indian Ocean has increased considerably. But I feel that Africa is still not really a top priority as some claim. I think this is partly because obviously India has other priorities, but there is ample scope for us to think about Africa more, and above all to back our words with action.
Right. Ambassador Bhatia, fascinating conversation, great insights. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Jacob.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.